from the Jocko Lakes Fire. And I said, well, that's great, Sam, but I'm going to need some help. And later that afternoon, I got a telephone call from a young woman who'd been on the Lolo Hotshot crew. And she was also a graduate student in anthropology and asked if I needed any help during the winter. And immediately I said, boy, are you in luck? Well, in terms of doing fire salvage for timber, there's a very short time frame in which the burned trees are still merchantable. And prior to harvest, we needed to do an environmental assessment, which included wildlife, soils, heritage, hydrology, and fisheries. And all of these must be completed before the timber is harvested. And prior to doing field work for the heritage program, I looked at our previous investigations and realized I had done a timber sale inventory as early as 1980. And we had found one culturally modified tree, and then the 1903 GLO plats showed that there were remnants of the old Jocko Indian Trail that ran through this area. So prior to going to the field, we stratified the proposed harvest areas into high, medium, and low probability areas, looked at our previous and any known sites in the area. And as I said, we did have one culturally modified tree, and this was a ponderosa pine where the Indians had peeled the bark back in the spring of the year because it had an extremely high cambium layer. And our first task was to see if this tree still existed as it was in the middle of the burned area. And this is the first day Jola Anya Minutes, the young graduate student, was working with me. And we're driving up the Placid Lake Road, and she's reading the site form and says, you know, Milo, you recorded this site 2 years before I was born. Well, that immediately made me start thinking about retirement. And as well as the culturally modified tree, the 1903 GLO plats showed that we had the Jocko Indian Trail running through this area. And I remember looking for segments of the trail in 1980, but the vegetation was just extremely thick and there was no way that we could have found it. Nevertheless, after we had found the peeled tree, we began walking crisscross transects across the bench above Placid Creek and before the Placid Creek Road. We had excellent ground visibility, and for identifying non-combustible metal artifacts, metal or stone. And I had worked on the Custer Battlefield archaeological project in 1985 after a wildfire had exposed numerous battle-related artifacts such as bullets, cartridge cases, etc. And so I was fully aware of the benefits that an immediately burned area has on doing archaeological survey. And as we're doing our survey, Anya
this button right here.
Okay.
Okay, there you go.
Anyway, Anya bends over and picks up a fired cartridge case and asks, is this anything historic? And I said, no, it's 30-06. It's a modern hunting round. So it was over 100 years old at that time, but nevertheless, it wasn't considered to be a historic artifact. Anya goes a little further and bends over and picks up a very small, stubby, unfired rifle cartridge. And again asks, is this anything? And let's see.
You going back to your slides?
Yeah. Anyway, I was really excited because I said, that's a 56-52 Spencer cartridge. And she says, well, how do you know? And I said, because I have one. And with that, I began telling her about the Spencer rifle. And I consider the Spencer to be the first assault rifle adopted by the US Army. And that was 1863, and it was primarily for cavalry units. And let's go back and put me on. I have one here. And this is what it looks like. It is a 7-shot repeater, and it has a magazine that loads through the buttstock. And it's a lever action that if you push down, it puts a rifle cartridge into the breech, close it, and you have to manually pull back the hammer, fire the weapon, and then you can repeat the sequence up until all 7 shots are fired. Anyway, this was an extremely popular weapon by the Union cavalry during the Civil War. Let's go back to the slides. And at the end of the Civil War, the Army, in their wisdom, went and adopted a single-shot rifle rather than a repeater, as they thought the soldiers would waste too much ammunition. Nevertheless, many of these were sold as surplus on the frontier and made their way west with both, and were popular with both Indians and settlers and fur traders. And the 56-52 Spencer was for the model 1865, and it had these grooves around the bullet, and hopefully you can see them. And here's some illustrations and that we had found within the burned area. And you can see the fire had affected some of the lead. Some of it had been melted. Also, some of it had been gnawed upon by rodents. But altogether, we found over 17 unfired Spencer cartridges. And I thought, that's amazing. I mean, people don't lose 17 unfired cartridges in the late 1800s. First of all, they're very difficult to come by. And they're very valuable, so you don't lose them. And after we found the cartridges, we began doing a metal detector survey, and as well as some archaeological testing. We didn't find any cultural material in the 1x1 test meter unit. But again, here's some of the Spencer cartridges. You can see how they've been affected by weather and by the burn and by rodent activity. And as I say, they were spread out quite a distance. The scale down here at the bottom is 20 feet. So they were spread out well over 150 feet in area. But what was unique as we were doing our survey and finding these unfired cartridges, all of a sudden we found a cache of very high value artifacts. And it was found near a burned stump. And these artifacts were probably deposited after or before the tree grew. And the stump had also been cut, and it had been cut after the artifacts had been deposited. And what we found was a cut nail, a whetstone, an axe, a pair of scissors, a bullet mold, a hide scraper, an 18-inch eye bolt, and a piece of slate. And again, here's a site map that shows the extent of the unfired cartridges. This little circle here is extent for the high value artifacts. And this is the axe head. And after it was cleaned up, we were able to name it the manufacturer. And this axe was manufactured in New York between 1840 and 1888. This is a cut nail, and it may have been used either with the axe head or as a tool wedge or possibly as a type of punch. 18-inch eye bolt and a sting. Thought that might have been used as part of a trap, to anchor a trap to the ground, or possibly as a meat skewer. And also unique was a pair of scissors, and it was very different from other artifacts. Possibly it was used for beard trimming, or for hide maintenance, or for sewing, or for cutting trade fabric. Another item was a bullet mold. And this bullet mold, once we measured it, it was for a 50 caliber round ball, which indicates to me that the party who lost these artifacts had at least two firearms, maybe more, but certainly they had the 56-52 Spencer, and in all probability, a 54 caliber round ball muzzleloader. And a whetstone that is used for sharpening knives or axes. And here's what I thought was really unique, was a buffalo hide scraper. Now, when we first found it, I had no idea what it was. We found the Spencer site late in the evening on a Friday. We did our inventory until just before dark, and then drove the hour and a half back to Missoula, arriving back in Missoula about 6:30, well past Miller time. And I wanted to see what this was. At first, I thought it was a big chisel, and I took it into our little coffee area at Fort Missoula and ran hot water under it, and washed off the ash and the mud and the grit. And all of a sudden, what came to light was a segment of an octagonal rifle barrel. It was 50 caliber. It had a dovetail on the front which would have been the location for the site. And then it had a little sprue down on the bottom, which would have held the ramrod. It was hand forged and tapered. And let's go back to where we were. And I've got,
I got you.
okay. I've got it here, and hopefully you can see it. Again, it's got this serrated edge, hand filed. It's been hand forged, flattened. Again, you can see the bore and the dovetail for the front sight. So when I said buffalo hide scraper, I was going to go to Carl P. Russell's Firearms, Traps, and Tools of the Mountain Men, which is kind of the Bible for fur trade artifacts. Anya, remember, she was a 25 at this time, immediately goes into the computer and Googles up buffalo hide scrapers. And what do we find is they were manufactured by the Hudson's Bay Company between 1807 and the 1840s. And there were some illustrations of them. You can see them up here in the upper right. And they were made from spent and broken gun barrels. And lo and behold, that's exactly what we had. So as I'm thinking Hudson's Bay Company, I'm thinking the Jocko Lakes Trail. And if you followed the Jocko Lakes Trail about 15, maybe 20 miles over the hill, you'd come to Fort Kona. And Fort Kona was a Hudson's Bay post. And it was noted to be a distribution center for buffalo items. And the Salish were known to have traveled out to the plains in the 1860s, 1870s, hunted buffalo, sold the hides in Fort Benton, dried the meat, sold it to Fort Kona, and Fort Kona would redistribute it to other Hudson's Bay posts further west, such as Fort Colville and Fort Vancouver. So all of a sudden, through these artifacts and the research that we were able to gather from them, information is coming to light about possible use of the trail and its relationship to Fort Kona and also to the plains. Another artifact was a piece of slate, which was possibly used as a hide finishing for hide scrapers. And a small scrap of metal. And it appears to have been affected by the fire, partially oxidized. And also along the trail, we were beginning to find what archaeologists call debitage, or pieces of flaked stone that were used in the manufacture of stone tools. And stone tools such as projectile points, knives, scrapers. And this particular piece was rose chert. Some of the other isolates we found, which again were chert. And when we found a collection of lithic scatter, we did some archaeological testing. And there you can see our crew putting in a 1x1 test meter unit. And this is what we called the Placid 1 site. And we didn't find any finished artifacts, but we did find a large collection of chip stone debitage, both secondary and tertiary flakes. The source was probably in the Flint Creek Valley, where chert nodules are found coming out of remnants of the Madison limestone. And these are all remnants from the manufacturing of stone tools, again, like projectile points, knives, or scrapers. Additionally, we began looking for segments of the Jocko Lakes Trail. And on the flats, we suspect that there was no evidence of trail tread because people would travel kind of spread out. There was no real reason to stay together in single file per se. However, when you came to ravine crossings, drainage crossings, people usually followed the path of least resistance and probably in single file. And lo and behold, we began finding segments of historic trail tread. And if you can see this individual in the front, that's Boyd Hartwig. He is standing on a segment of trail tread. And then that's me in the far background. I don't know if you can see me or not, but again, standing on a segment of trail tread where the trail indeed crosses a drainage. And again, to the right, highlighted is the Jocko Indian Trail from the 1903 General Land Office map. Although we inventoried about 1.5 miles of the Jocko Indian Trail, and we found one prehistoric site with the Placid site that I just discussed, one historic site, the Spencer site, with the unfired cartridges and the collection of high-value artifacts, and then intact segments of the Jocko Trail. We strongly suspect that other evidence of prehistoric or historic use exists along the Jocko Indian Trail. What I'm saying is the research on this particular cultural resource is certainly not complete. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that the timing for this inventory, this survey, was extremely fortuitous. The ground visibility after the fire was excellent. Obviously, we were able to find the 17 unfired cartridges, the high-value artifacts, the isolated stone artifacts. However, 2 weeks later, it snowed and covered all the information that we were so fortunate to have found prior to that. And then likewise in the spring, when the snow melted, the vegetation began to come back very thick. So it was very fortuitous that we had that 2-3 week window in which to do our inventory and which to find these significant heritage resources. And what did we learn? Well, we were building on existing information from the 1980 inventory with a culturally modified tree and the Jocko Indian Trail. Secondly, we did locate physical remnants of the Jocko Indian Trail, numerous prehistoric isolates, a prehistoric archaeological site, as well as the historic Spencer site. And what it appears is the Jocko Trail appears to have played a significant role in at least the late fur trade and was used during the prehistoric period as well. If one travels east from Fort Kona over the Jocko Indian Trail and turns right on the Clearwater River, it's not very far down to the Blackfoot and what Lewis and Clark referred to as the trail to the buffalo. So I suspect the Jocko Trail was used not only in prehistoric times, but well into the historic period, not only for the buffalo trade, but as a very significant travel route. With that, that concludes my presentation, and I'm open to any questions. Oh, before that, I'd like to again thank our crew, Joel and Anya Minutes, the young graduate student, has gone on to work on her PhD at the University of Chicago. She is finishing up as we speak. She also had the opportunity to work at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, doing recovery on forensic work on missing in action from the Vietnam War. The top right is Boyd Hartwig, who is our public affairs officer. Boyd retired from the Lolo National Forest. Bottom right is Steve Platt. He was the archaeologist for Montana Department of Transportation, and he retired a couple of years ago. And the upper left is Kermit Edmonds, who was a very prominent high school history teacher at Hellgate for many years, and who passed away a couple of years ago. And then the lower right is Justin Moschel, who is currently an archaeologist with the Forest Service here in Missoula. And then the short little guy on the right is me. Okay, so that concludes my presentation. And if we have any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Okay, I'm sort of off to the side from Milo right now, and I'm going to read some questions from the chat, Milo, and hopefully you can answer them. I'm not sure. So you've answered a couple of these questions just in your talk, in that people were talking about what was the exact location of the Jocko Trail, and did it connect the Buffalo Hunt Road up the Blackfoot River.
Okay.
So can you give a good sense of a starting and an ending point maybe for the trail?
Well, first of all these trails tie together, and where one ends and the other begins is subject to interpretation. But let's say the Jocko Trail began in the Mission Valley and somewhere around Arlee, and followed Jocko Creek up over the divide, and then coming down Placid Creek to the Clearwater River, and then forked with one segment going to the north up the Clearwater and Seeley Lake, Rainy Lake. And some people show it going as far as Pyramid Pass up into the Bob Marshall country. The other fork would go to the right and down the Clearwater River and tie into the Blackfoot, or the trail to the Buffalo, as described by Lewis and Clark.
Great. Okay, so I have a personal question, which, well, not a personal question, a question for me personally.
Okay.
Every now and then, it just seems like archaeology is a bunch of luck. You were saying that a couple of weeks later in a snowfall, you might have missed all this stuff. Over the course of your career, has luck struck a few times?
Yes and no. As I say, in 1980, when we first found that culturally modified tree, an antenna went up that said, something's going on here. You don't find just one culturally modified tree by itself, but unless it's associated with something. And then we found the 1903 GLO plat that showed the Jocko Indian Trail. Well, I had done research on the Lolo Trail prior to this, and we found numerous culturally modified trees along the Lolo Trail, just west of Howard Creek on the way up to Lolo Pass. And we looked for segments of the Jocko Trail, but the vegetation was just so thick, we couldn't find it until after the fire, and things became readily apparent. Luck. Well, luck, perseverance. I worked on one archaeological site over on the Custer National Forest years ago, and it was in a rock shelter. And we dug a 2-meter by 2-meter test pit, and we got down to over 10 feet deep. And the soil, it wasn't even soil, it was called caliche. It was just almost like concrete. And I was down there with a pick trying to break up this caliche, put it into a bucket and haul it up and put it through a 1/4-inch wire screen. And one blow with the pick, I noticed this little red chert flake pop. And I thought, boy, you may have hit something. So I got my trowel out and worked away. And sure enough, at 10 feet 3 inches was an intact Scott's Bluff projectile point. Now the Scott's Bluff point is what we call the Paleo-Indian period. And this would be about 9,000, 9,500 years old. And out on the left corner, you could see where that small chip had broken off, and I had come down with the tip of the pick right on the edge of the projectile point. And had I been 1/2 inch to the right, I would have shattered the entire thing. So, yeah.
Yep. So I guess there's a little luck, but opportunity. As you were saying that, I was thinking it's really the names of all these Mars rovers that have been out there, right? Perseverance and opportunity and curiosity.
I think perseverance is the big thing, Molly. And one thing I wanted to point out, and I tried to state at the beginning, is we build on existing knowledge. And yeah, we started this inventory with what we learned in 1980, and then applied that to the changing environmental conditions, and it really paid off.
So I have a couple of other questions from the chat. Was the site where you were working there on the job that we were just talking about, was that subsequently salvage logged after the fire there?
It was. Now, it's interesting because when we do inventories and we document archaeological or historic sites, we apply the criteria for eligibility for the National Register of Historic Places. And initially, the Spencer site was clearly eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. Everything was on the surface. It had no subsurface component. It was one time period of occupation of when these artifacts, the cartridges, et cetera, were deposited. Once we picked those up, once we salvaged them, if you will, the site no longer had value. Because the information that the site once held is now in these little boxes,
Right.
and documented in photographs and field notes. So, yeah, I assume they went in and salvaged the timber there.
Do you know if the culturally modified tree that you first that pointed you in that direction, if that is still standing?
Actually, it's not. The woman who replaced me on the Lolo, Sydney Bacon, went up there a couple of years ago and was monitoring to see if the culturally modified tree was still standing. They found it, but it had fallen down. And I suspect during the Jocko fire that the fire had affected the root system. And, you know, a strong wind 2, 3, 4 years later, and down it came.
Here's an interesting question from Betsy. Do you know where the name Jocko comes from?
You know, I don't. And I should. That would be interesting to pursue.
All right, folks, if there's anybody on this program that knows where the name Jocko came from, type it in the chat for me.
Oh, one more thing I would like to add is we don't know who deposited artifacts. It might have been Native American, might have been Euro-American fur traders. What we suspect is it was sometime after 1867 because of the 56, 52 Spencer cartridges were the 1865 model, and probably prior to the mid 1870s. That's when the Salish were going to the plains and hunting buffalo. After the mid 1870s, the buffalo were pretty well eliminated. What happened? I don't know. Was it simply a matter of a pack breaking and this material falling out? Was there a rodeo with string and bucking horses and packs broke? It was probably during the late fall or early spring of the year when there was snow on the ground, and the travelers did not miss their lost items until they got to their next destination. And trying to find them in the snow would have been next to impossible.
Right.
That's only speculation. We don't know.
So I'm going to ask Jim S. to unmute because he has an answer to the question about Jocko. Jim, can you tell us?
Jocko Finley. He was Canadian originally and is part of my wife's ancestry. So that's how I clued in on that one. But he also worked for Hudson Bay.
Interesting. Do you know, Jim, if that's where the Finley name that's so well distributed on the Flathead Reservation comes from as well?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay. And so Carrie just typed in that Jocko was a Métis fur trapper or fur trader. So there we go. That explains a lot. We all learned something here today. There was one other, and folks, there are a couple of other comments in the chat about Jocko. So if you want to read along, you certainly can. Chuck has a question about if there was any explanation of the scattering of the Spencer cartridges. Is it sort of that same question of maybe the pack broke or somebody had a hole in his pocket? Or?
That's about all we can determine. I've thought about someone having a hole in their pocket. But no, they were spread out pretty much in a line, like someone was traveling and they kind of end up near that cluster of high value artifacts by the stump.
Right. Interesting.
But again, it amazes me that the artifacts were deposited before the tree grew. And then that tree was cut down probably in the 50s or 60s, and again, probably in the snow. And whoever cut it down had no idea that they were standing on this cache of high value artifacts.
Right. So
again, very fortuitous that they existed until we came along.
Absolutely, absolutely. I wanted to bring up a question that came up. I'm not sure if it was in Jamie's presentation last week, but he was talking about bears up around here, or maybe it was a different presentation, but the Lolo's grave that's nearby. Did you work on that?
I didn't. I was certainly aware of it, and I know Dan Hall pretty well, who worked on that, and I know Kelly Dixon, a professor at the university, brought the cadaver dogs up, and they did just about everything they could to identify that grave, other than exhume any skeletal remains.
Interesting.
But no, it's supposedly right on the ridge above Graves Creek.
Which is how Graves Creek gets its name, right?
Exactly.
Great, great. I think it's interesting. I don't know. I think those of us that grew up watching Indiana Jones had a different vision of archaeology. I've been fortunate to work here and to get to know you a little bit, and Dan Hall, and learn a little bit more about archaeology. And actually, for me, the most fortunate thing maybe is being able to teach young kids about archaeology. We had 4 virtual field trips this week. And I think, Ryan, did we teach about, I don't know, 60 first graders or second graders what the word archaeology means? And they were really fired up about it. So you may have some extra or some successors coming on from Stevensville Elementary.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, Molly, because I had to wait till I got to college to even know it existed. And I started out as a history major at University of New Mexico, but took my first anthropology course in my freshman year and quickly learned that historians spend their time in the library, whereas archaeologists spend their time in the field. And looking out on the West Mesa from the university and the 10,000-year-old Folsom sites and the existing pueblos, and New Mexico is just a fascinating place for archaeology. So I quickly changed my major.
Well, we're sure glad you did. Does anybody else have any questions that they would like to type into the chat? Okay, well, I think then we're going to just wrap up with a few notes. If you have a question, go ahead and type it while I'm talking a little bit about our auction, which is actually live now. If anybody is interested, you can go to our website or go to, it's a long URL, www.32auctions.com/Travelers Rest Connection 21. And we have lots of great items up for bid. And I hope that you will all take a chance to look. It's a great way to support programs like this and our AmeriCorps members who were here with the great tech support today and our field trip programs that we were just talking about. Milo, we've got lots of comments in the chat saying thank you. We really enjoyed it. So we're grateful that you were here today.
Well, thank you, Molly.
You're very welcome. And do you have a final word that you wanted to add?
Well, as I said, I've given this many times before, but I always enjoy doing it because, again, I think it illustrates, what we can learn from archaeology, what we can learn from the artifacts, and how we build on existing information. To most people, walking through the woods and finding an unfired Spencer bullet would be merely a curiosity. But putting that together along with the cache of high value artifacts, the Jocko Trail, Fort Kona, the Buffalo Trade, the artifacts began to tell a very significant story about Montana history and prehistory.
Great. Oh, we did have one fun little question pop up from our friend Stephanie Ambrose Tubbs. She wants to know if you've got good ghost stories from the Little Bourne battlefield.
I've got a few.
You're welcome to share one if you want.
Molly?
Yes, Dale.
I couldn't get into the chat on my screen, but regarding the grave of Lolo, going back a ways, Bud Moore remembered when there was a gravestone marking his grave. And so Bud went up with some of our compatriots and showed him where the trail went through that area and where he thought that the gravestone had been. But there had been logging going on, and so they couldn't find any evidence. So we went up with metal detectors and scoured through that whole area, and all we found was, I think, a frying pan handle and some bullets. And so then they came up with a magnetometer and did a survey through there, and they found a suspectful location for the body. where the grave was. They did not mark it on the ground so it would have been visible, but when they brought the cadaver dogs up, they turned them loose. Cadaver dogs went and sat down on the exact same spot. And so when we remonumented the grave and had a ceremony up there, we suspect that we were in the right place, but we didn't. No excavation was ever done, and that's about what I know about it.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Dale. I think it is interesting. It's maybe a mystery for some future archaeologists, or maybe a mystery that will just remain unsolved. And those are okay too. They keep us all looking. Everybody, thank you so much. I think this was another great day. Next week, we're going to have Indigenous artist D.G. House and Frank Finley joining us to talk about Native American art. And I hope that you'll join us for that. And again, please go check out the auction site. You can link from our website or from the 32 Auctions website for Travelers Rest Connection. And we'd really appreciate your support. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you next week.